China was one of the world's poorest nations and the most populous. So you had more poor people in China than any place else in the world. When I was in China in November, you would think you were in downtown Manhattan.
Welcome to Beating Sisyphus, a production of the Casanova Center for Emerging Markets in collaboration with the Cornell Emerging Markets Institute Club, live from Ithaca, New York. We bring together leaders from across economics, technology, and policy to explore how innovation emerges under pressure. My name is Thomas Riveros, and I have the honor to co-host alongside Lourdes Casanova, the director of the Casanova Center. Joining us today is one of the most distinguished voices in development economics, Professor Christopher Barrett. Chris is the Stephen B. and Janice G. Ashley Professor of Applied Economics and Management and International Professor of Agriculture at Cornell. He is a professor at the Jeb E. Brooks School of Public Policy and a leading figure at the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. His work is truly global in scope, focusing on how we can transform agri-food systems to be more resilient and equitable. From pioneering research on poverty traps to food aid, to his recent work on how technological innovations can help us feed a growing planet without destroying it, his insights have shaped policy at the highest levels, including the U.S. Congress and United Nations. Chris, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. So I will start with the first question. So you have dedicated your career to the economics of poverty and food security. Why is that? And in this context, why should we look at it and look at agricultural systems?
So in 1979, Ted Schultz was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. And in his Nobel acceptance speech, the opening sentence went something like, most people in the world are poor, so if we knew the economics of poverty, we'd know the economics that really matters. That's basically the answer. Most people in the world don't enjoy the material comforts we enjoy, living in a nice college town in upstate New York in the United States. We enjoy all sorts of benefits that even my parents, my mom was a war refugee. My dad grew up during the Depression in the slums of the Bronx. Their living conditions were materially inferior to what we enjoy now, but better than that of many people in rural areas of the global South. So the simple answer to the question is, if you're going to study something that matters if you get the answers right. And this is a topic where getting the answers right can materially change people's lives.
And in relation with that, before we started the podcast, we were talking about how poverty in the last 25 years, so we have conquered poverty in the sense that the numbers have gone down dramatically in extreme poverty and also poverty from 2000 till 2015. They have continued decreasing till now, but in a lower level, we are going to say. So why you think is that, and have we solved the problem of extreme poverty already?
We certainly haven't solved the problem of extreme poverty, but we should take great comfort and encouragement from the phenomenal progress that we've seen over the past 50 years. When China began its major reforms in the late 1970s, the household responsibility system and all of the various reforms that went along with that, China was one of the world's poorest nations and the most populous. So you had more poor people in China than any place else in the world. When I was in China in November, you would think you were in downtown Manhattan. It is just phenomenally advanced now. Not all parts of the country, obviously, but China made a massive commitment to investing in public goods, to investing in infrastructure, to investing in new technologies. It's investing significantly more in research and development than the United States is, for example. But it also got many institutional reforms right. It engaged in sensible policies in many spheres, starting with ending the state control of individual decision-making. China still has lots and lots of problems, to be clear. It's far from kind of a utopia, but the possibilities unlocked by simply making good long-run investments and getting basic first-order policies right should tell us something about the potential to make progress in other places that have not yet had similar sorts of advances. Vietnam's a similar story. So I think the encouraging part of the last 50 years is the very clear demonstration that getting policies right and investing in the long-run potential of a population can pay off incredibly handsomely. The downside is that we now are also increasingly recognizing that not everybody has the conditions Vietnam and China have enjoyed. And they were launching their incredibly rapid poverty reduction experiences before the climate crisis, before we had seen a really significant rise in average food prices around the world, as most of the high-income world has been disinvesting from agricultural R&D, and before we saw a significant run-up in violent conflict around the world. I mean, Africa has more wars now than it has since the spate of independence in the early 1960s. Poverty today is increasingly concentrated in a small number of places that suffer multiple major risks at once. They suffer extreme weather events, droughts and floods, and episodes of really prolonged high heat. They suffer conflict, and they suffer commonly novel disease and pathogen outbreaks. Think Ebola, think COVID. When you mix these various different threats together at once, it's really hard to break out. That's exactly where poverty traps emerge. And so at some level, the world, and in particular the governments of China, Vietnam, a few other places, unlocked the potential in their populations by addressing underinvestment and serious policy errors and institutional errors. And there's still room for progress in those places and elsewhere where you haven't had those sorts of investments and reforms. But it's a harder task today. At some level, the low-hanging fruit has been harvested, but also the challenges are just greater. We've faced more headwinds now in tackling extreme poverty in the places where it exists at significant scale.
So that's really interesting. You mentioned a number of factors. Firstly, that poverty is now concentrated in these areas that are facing these very specific, problems and crises, weather events, conflict, disease, things along those lines that make it really hard for those, perhaps more orthodox institutional reforms to be as effective. Now, when we think about what you just mentioned with poverty traps, could you describe kind of that overall idea? From my understanding, taking development classes, it's generally thought of as you have people, getting stuck at a certain level. So they have subsistence, but because, either caloric intake or whatever it might be is not high enough, they can't really start seeing those increasing or those larger returns as they continue kind of out in terms of their caloric intake, in terms of their production.
Yeah, so poverty trap exists when people's optimal behaviors leave them poor. So it's not that they're making systematic mistakes, that simply fixing their mistakes, they'd be on a better trajectory where they could accumulate assets and technology and human capital and become more productive and earn higher incomes. It's that they're actually doing about the best one can do in those circumstances. So the question then becomes, what are the circumstances? And in economics, we commonly think of this in terms of multiple market failures, meaning there are several things at once that one has to do on the self. You can't just go buy an insurance policy to cover extreme downside risk exposure. You can't just go to the bank and borrow money because there's this wonderful investment opportunity ahead of you. The old adage, it takes money to make money, is true, but you have to ask, why is that true? It's because if you don't have access to money, you don't have the opportunity to take advantage of high return options. if you can borrow, you're fine. But in especially much of the rural global South, you simply don't have financial systems that work very well. So people are stuck with the resources they already have. And then if you live in rural areas where poverty traps are especially salient, you commonly have to rely on the agricultural economy. You either farm or you work for farmers, at least part-time. Most farmers actually have non-farm work as well. But farming is an unusual industry in that there are these very long lags between when you make initial investments, when you buy a calf, or when you pay for seed and put it in the ground before the calf turns into a cow that will give you milk and calves itself, or the seed germinates and turns into a crop that you can harvest and eat or sell. And that long biological lag that exists in agricultural production creates a massive window for a lot of different risks to enter in. Nature doesn't always cooperate. The elephants can walk through your maize field. Your cow can get infected with a disease that kills it. You might fall sick from malaria right when you most need to plant your crop. And so you miss that window by 2 weeks while you recover, and your yields are significantly reduced as a result. There are so many different factors that can hit. And that's part of the challenge faced in rural areas without well-functioning financial markets, is that there's not a single risk. If there were a single risk, we could almost certainly design financial products that could provide a solution. It's the myriad risks, the fact that they face multidimensional exposure, that makes it really challenging to devise ways that can protect people against the shocks that can enter in, that can give them the opportunity to invest in improving their and their families' prospects. And that becomes self-reinforcing, because when people don't earn much money, then they can't invest in protecting themselves against some of these risks. They can't buy the improved technologies that will enable them to have a little bit more investable resources. So that's why it becomes self-reinforcing, that not having money begets staying poor, in part because you just can't manage the risks that you face.
And in the private sphere, banks are kind of unwilling or unable in a lot of these contexts to go in and make those loans. What do you think is a constraint there? Because if it's from the government perspective, the government, say, has some regulation, it makes this banking system very inefficient. But, in theory, you would suppose that you could probably get very high returns on loans given to those given to those farmers, because, again, they're very low on the production function. They're going to have very high marginal returns, just to a little bit of extra capital. Why haven't we seen the private sector in a lot of these cases kind of step in?
Yeah, there have been a range of efforts. There was a big microfinance revolution. Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize for spearheading this through an organization called the Grameen Bank that he founded in Bangladesh. Let me turn to an analog, which is the insurance industry. Likewise, finance, but it's slightly different set of financial products. My group has worked extensively in East Africa in dry lands where there are herders. It's basically too dry to reliably cultivate crops, so people rely on extensive grazing of livestock. Think of like West Texas or New Mexico or such places where, you just imagine seeing cattle grazing the rangelands. Yes. Very similar sort of setting. The problem there, which is analogous to the problem of credit, is you have lots of small producers spread out over space. There are a lot of risks you face. So if you're a bank and you extend credit, or you're an insurance company and you provide them insurance against their cows dying, then when they call up and say, yeah, indeed, I lost half of my herd, it's very difficult to tell whether that was something that was avoidable or that was really their fault. If they've got toothpicks and they're kind of pulling steak out from between their teeth, then you suspect that maybe they're trying to fleece you as a financial institution. If by contrast, you see the lions all look really well fed in this area and there are carcasses around that clearly have been attacked, then you can be pretty confident that it's predators. But the transactions costs of loan verification or loss verification are really, really prohibitive. So the challenge becomes getting to scale so that a financial institution can enter these areas and have adequate volume that it can expect to make money, and that it can avoid the correlated risk problem. That, if the drought hits, everybody loses their animals at the same time, all of your loans go belly up at the same time, or all of your insurance policy holders are filing claims at the same time. So you need reinsurance. So we came up with a solution to that, actually, by using a very low-cost method. Just use the data coming from satellite streams that tells us how much greenness is on the surface of the earth, which is a very good proxy for how dense is the grass on the rangelands. And it turns out that correlates quite nicely with livestock mortality. So we could develop a product, an insurance product, that was a livestock mortality product, but it was specifically measured off of these vegetation indices coming from satellite data streams that were freely available to everybody. It wasn't proprietary, it wasn't manipulable by either party. And you could write a contract that made this very clear. And the insurance companies could sell this through networks of agents on the ground, and then they could offload those policies. So when we initially developed this in 2010, 93% of the risk went out of Kenya, where we ran the pilot from the local underwriter. 93% of the risk went to a global reinsurance company. So you basically have taken drought risk in East Africa and put it into global capital markets, so that if bad things happen to the herders in Africa, the folks who pay up are in Switzerland. And in between, the insurance companies that intermediate are making reasonably good profits with relatively modest risk exposure. This is scalable. So this is now in multiple countries, and the World Bank is pushing it quite hard. So we're up over 4 million policy holders. But these are the sorts of things you have to develop to deal with the multidimensional risk, because this is one, and it's a very incomplete solution because it helps with one piece of the problem. But there's good evidence that this is unlocking potential. We've gone and followed up households 10 years after we launched the product, and we found that 10 years later, those who were randomized into buying up the product, we gave randomized discounts so that we could use that to tease out who was buying the product, basically because we sort of nudged them into it. So we have a good experimental design. But those who are randomized into receiving the product, their children are getting educated more. We could see in near term right away benefits in terms of when droughts hit, there were less distress sales of their surviving herd. There was less skipping of meals because people couldn't afford to buy food when their cows were no longer lactating. We saw people investing more in their herds because they had the prospect of being able to get something that they would recover in the event that they lost their herds. So it was starting to unlock potential in a system where there's very clearly a poverty trap.
That's incredible. I love the on-the-ground work and making verifiable the large impact on people's lives.
Yeah, it's been enormously satisfying to watch that grow, and extremely frustrating to see how hard it is to make progress. All the complexities of the various institutions that are involved in this, the challenges associated with things that are way outside the sphere of this one little insurance product. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a piece of the solution that seems to be helping to address a real need within an extremely poor and vulnerable population.
Just to add to Thomas' question, I was in Ghana with a group of MPAs last month, and we see how mobile payments are growing all over Africa, including Kenya. And based on that, because of course, a lot of the poor people, not a bank account is too expensive. So then we see starting to have loans, small loans, based on the know your customer through the mobile usage. How do you see that? We see Momo from MTN, we see Haptel getting into the space. In Brazil, Pix, the mobile payment that has been very, very successful. How do you see that moving into offering loans insurance through the data that provides the mobile phone usage.
The mobile phone revolution is a game changer, especially in more remote rural areas where the cost of putting up fixed lines is prohibitive and just not going to happen in any current resident's lifetime. I mean, when I first started working in those rangelands in East Africa, like if you were in southern Ethiopia, you had no hope of being able to call somebody. So herders were at the mercy of traders who would show up in kind of the major market towns with a lorry, with a truck. The herders had no idea what the prevailing prices in the terminal markets in Addis Ababa or Nairobi would be because they couldn't call somebody to ask. But the traders obviously had that information because they'd just driven down the day before, driven up the day before. So, this was an incredibly asymmetric negotiating position to be in. And as you would expect, traders extracted most of the value of the animals that were being offloaded. Well, now, if you go to these markets, you see folks, they reach into their robes and they whip out a mobile phone and they're calling somebody at Dagoretti Market to find out, I've got a 5-year-old steer, what's the going price, body condition's good, and, they're on a level playing field for negotiating. So for things like that, it's a game changer. It's also a game changer for distributed families. Many families have someone who's gone to a city or at least a town. They're not local anymore, but they can reach out to them, and with mobile money, people can send transfers. There's a nice literature establishing how the mobile phone network's expansion is providing the connectivity that lets families insure one another to stabilize against shocks. One of the other important things that's happening is it used to be that women would go sell milk and they come back from market with a handful of cash, or more commonly cash tucked into a pouch, and their husbands would ask for the money. Now a woman's got mobile money on her phone and she gets more control over it. She can move this around. She can push it into a different account. So when her husband says, let me see how much you got in your account, she says, here, I've got 1,000 shillings, because she moved 11,000 shillings off to something else. And so there's actually good evidence that we're seeing more women building up small businesses because they're able to retain control over resources and invest in promising opportunities that help them and their children. Mobile phones are creating lots of really good opportunities. They help us to solve problems that are created by the high cost of putting in infrastructure. But they too are not magic bullets. They're parts of solutions. So you constantly need to come up with the bundle of innovations, new financial products with phones that let you distribute them more broadly, with vaccines for livestock disease that reduce the risk exposure. So it's not just transferring risk when bad things happen, it's also reducing the likelihood that they happen at all. You bundle those things together and you start to unlock the potential that continues to hold back that kind of core of extreme poor people in rural areas that haven't enjoyed the miraculous performance of China and Vietnam.
So going back to a more macro question, you have done a lot of work on aid. Aid is being questioned from the right and the left, from the donors and the receivers. So how do you see, or how we Western nations should change, and we should, the way we support emerging markets and poor economies?
Yeah, so it's been a difficult 15 months. And people often think this is just the Trump administration in the United States, but donors all over the world have been cutting back. I've just come back a couple of days ago from the UK. The UK used to contribute 0.7% of its gross national income as foreign aid, which is kind of the agreed target of the wealthy nations, the OECD countries. Now they're cutting back to 0.3%. They've just kept chopping their aid. The French are doing the same, other countries are doing the same. So this isn't just an American thing. Whether you like it or not, this is reality. And from my perspective, this creates an opportunity. because the aid industry, and it is an industry, people often think of it as pure charity, but there's an active industry with lots of well-paid executives and professionals, most of whom are extremely good at their jobs, but like every other industry, there's some calcification in some areas, and shaking it up has done a lot of damage, but can ultimately turn into benefits. And one of the potential benefits is if it gets us to think again about where really are the highest returns to scarce aid flows. Now that the amounts are cut back, you simply can't afford to do everything. So reprioritization can be a healthy thing. Never waste a crisis, right? And some of the things that we've massively underinvested in are global public goods, in investments in agricultural R&D in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s yielded phenomenal returns. I mean, the Green Revolution, which has had some environmental side effects that need attention, but there are very good estimates that literally hundreds of thousands of children are alive because of the improved seed and the packages that went in to improving agricultural productivity. We've got massive savings of forests that would have been cut down to feed people. That was all funded by philanthropic and public R&D. None of that was private sector profit-seeking investment. But those budgets have fallen in inflation-adjusted terms dramatically over the last 25 years. Likewise, biomedical research and health investments pay really high dividends, and we were seeing big increases in investments in health interventions. That, unfortunately, has really been gutted with the most recent cuts over the last 15 months. But there, too, there's the ability to get back in the game on things like prevention of HIV/AIDS transmission from others to children. One of the big challenges that businesses around the world are going to have over the lifetimes of our students, Lourdes, maybe not your or my lifetimes, is a healthy, well-educated workforce. The populations of Europe and soon North America, China are peaking or already in decline. People aren't having many children. All of the rest of us are aging out of the workforce. Where is that future workforce? It's in the global south. It's overwhelmingly in Africa. And if you don't we know that the early stages of childhood leave a permanent imprint on adults. Our Cornell colleague, John Hodnott, has done this phenomenal work in Guatemala where they had early childhood interventions back in the 70s, and they tracked those children now as they have become adults and now parents, becoming grandparents. And the improvements in cognitive function, the improvements in stature, in adult lifetime earnings, in educational attainment, you name the metric, big gains from modest investments in improved early childhood nutrition. Similarly, vaccination so that kids don't suffer serious infectious disease episodes early in life. Even if they survive them, they often leave them permanently impaired, physically stunted, which is directly associated with lower labor productivity later in life. These are really high return investments intrinsically because just having healthy children alive is of immense value unto itself before anyone ever becomes productive, but also because they're then going to be healthy, productive workers later on and consumers with disposable income to buy their products from businesses. So why we don't see this in our collective self-interest for the long run to invest in early childhood health and nutrition, and why we have cut this back and spend money on really short-term things, I don't understand. And my hope is that the reforms to aid programs will lead us to invest more in early childhood health and nutrition, in agricultural R&D, in helping to mitigate climate change, which likewise is a global public good. Returning to the core, really high long-run return investments.
No, absolutely. I think I do. I certainly hope as well that we can focus on those high return areas. Then now, as you mentioned, like aid industry can really kind of consolidate and focus on those things that are, again, going to be the most effective in the long term. Now, I was wondering, why don't we see this? You mentioned specifically in the agriculture space, there's not as much R&D spending, and it's not really coming from the private sector. In the U.S., we do have very large agriculture firms. I don't know how much, I'm sure they invest a good deal, but, what's making that kind of gap start to emerge? And why do you think, we wouldn't see a socially optimal level of investment into the R&D by the private sector alone?
So first of all, the private sector now invests more in agricultural R&D than the public sector does, not just in the high-income world. That's true in China too. Because there are reasonably high returns to R&D investments. But those returns are diminishing as we put less into public R&D. It's important to keep in mind that there's a sequencing here. Public sector research and development investments, USDA, NIH, NSF, the various federal agencies that invest in research are generating basic discoveries. They are the building blocks. Keep in mind that a company that invests in R&D, it puts a lot of money in for several years, and imagine that those several years generate really promising fruit and they decide to patent a new technology. Well, when they file for the patent, then the clock starts ticking before the patent's going to expire. They have a narrow window in which they can recoup their upfront costs through the state-protected monopoly that is a patent holder's right. So to recoup their costs, they have to ensure that basically the payoffs are coming in the relatively near term. And so we see that indeed the returns to privately held patents return almost entirely in the first 10 to 15 years, while public sector R&D generates returns that are peaking at 15 to 30 years, much of it beyond the life of any patent. But private sector patents are building on public sector discoveries. So when we reduce public R&D, we wind up having less, if you will, feedstock for the private sector labs to work with. So you get less private sector R&D and lower returns to it, and therefore less investment. So it starts from where are the philanthropies and the governments investing in the basic building blocks. And climate change means the nature of agriculture and of food systems in general is, keep in mind that there are pests and pathogens out there literally trying to eat our lunch every day. Evolutionary pressures mean that your best technology today is going to be much less effective in 5 years' time, because the pests that are able to, the pathogens that are able to attack that crop grown with best practices today are the ones that are going to survive and going to further reproduce and just become a bigger pressure. So you're constantly having to innovate in agriculture just to keep pace. It's a treadmill. There's a long-standing imagery in agricultural economics of a technology treadmill, that you got to exert yourself. You're not actually moving, you're just staying in place by exerting yourself. And that's just fundamentally the nature of the evolutionary system of agriculture. When the public sector isn't making the kind of pump priming investments, we start slipping backwards. And we're already starting to see significant evidence of that. That's the all-time low inflation-adjusted wholesale price of food in the world was December 1999, was the turn of the millennium. So over your lifetimes, you undergraduates, food prices on average have been rising steadily. They're up about 75% in inflation-adjusted terms since December 1999. This is wholesale. It's not what you see on the grocery shelf. But ask yourself, why is that? It's because demand growth has dramatically outpaced supply growth. Demand growth has come from population growth and income growth and urbanization, all of which just increased demand for food. Food production has been growing. We keep hitting new records year on year, but it doesn't grow as fast as demand grows. And so the imbalance between the rate of growth in demand and the rate of growth of supply naturally leads to higher prices. That is going to continue, and we already see it creating problems around the world. It's going to continue until such time as we reinvigorate R&D investments. Part of that is political. Farm groups have made a very short-term calculus that they want subsidies of their insurance, they want bailout money, and when push comes to shove, they're going to trim the R&D budgets, or at least not raise them in nominal terms, which means in effective inflation-adjusted terms, the R&D budget is falling. The U.S. R&D budget, public R&D budget, is down by 30% in the last 20 years. It's not that we're spending less on the farm sector.
We get a lot of subsidies.
It's that the vast majority of the subsidies under farm bill authorizations and supplementals go to covering crop insurance and covering bailouts after things like trade wars. Farmers get blasted, and because China doesn't buy our soybeans, we send $11 billion off to farmers. The total R&D budget is less than $5 billion. One bailout package for farmers was more than double the annual R&D budget.
Yeah.
Yeah, but however, it's very difficult to cut subsidies to the agricultural sector, because what happens if another pandemic comes? We have to be able to feed our people in US, in Europe, in Japan. So the rich countries are subsidizing agriculture. Those who don't is the emerging markets, because they don't have the budget. But
You're absolutely right. But that's my point, is that in order to be ready for the next disaster, you have to invest in your future agricultural productivity growth, not just paying off for policy errors today or paying off for a bad weather event, which likewise is partially a series of policy errors in the past of not dealing with the climate crisis adequately. So it's that within the agricultural budgets, we're making trade-offs that today's farmers enjoy short-term gains at the cost of their children's future. And at the same time, those same farmers complain that none of their children want to take over the farm. There's a farm succession crisis, right? But who would want to take over a farm when nature is becoming less cooperative, governments are waging trade wars on your commodities, and you know full well that nobody's investing seriously in helping to deal with the weeds and the pests and the soil problems and the aquifer issues that you're going to be confronting in 10 years. You know that the research pipeline is not flowing at the rate it should be. So why would you step in to inherit that?
Yeah. So, it's very interesting. You highlight there, we need to shift away from the subsidy model where we're paying farmers, basically based off production, based off of short-term gains, things like that. And yeah, there's a lot of economic literature on farm subsidies. I think it's one thing that most economists agree are generally don't make very much economic sense.
Especially when they come at the cost of disinvestment in R&D that has extremely high returns, not least of which because of how much private sector R&D it crowds in, because the two are complements, not substitutes.
Yeah. And the additional emissions it causes as well from overproduction as well. There's a lot of good estimates that I've seen looking at basically how much additional emissions are caused as a result of that. And it's kind of crazy. So
now the exciting places are in the global south. China, Brazil, India, they've been dramatically increasing their agricultural R&D over the last 20 years. China long ago overtook the United States, like more than a decade ago. Brazil, in per capita terms, caught the United States back in 20-teens. Now, there's a reason why U.S. farmers are losing market share to Brazilian farmers, because Brazilian farmers have become incredibly efficient. The public R&D through Embrapa, the Brazilian agency, has dramatically outpaced what used to be the state of the art, the U.S. land grant university and USDA system. Brazil is run circles around us, and China is too now. China has launched these amazing experiments they call science and technology backyards, where they take master's degree students at universities and they have them spend a year doing intensive coursework, learning the relevant science, and then they go base in communities, working very closely with the local farmers, the local farm input dealers, the local buyers, a bakery or a mill that is buying up product, to figure out what are the things holding back this community, what can I tweak, what are the improvements in seed variety or irrigation technology or contracting, what is it we need to do, what's the bundle needed for this place? And they are generating really rapid gains as a result of that. Chinese agriculture is developing very, very quickly. And a lot of it is because of this investment in locally grounded R&D that we aren't doing here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, a big point to make here is this public sector investment by the U.S. is a global good. Like, it is a part of this aid equation that we're talking about.
It is, although to a limited degree, because it's not happening in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's not happening in the poorer countries in Latin America and parts of Asia, where you still have really decrepit agricultural R&D systems. And the problem is that you can do the basic research in the high-income countries or Brazil or China, but there's a technology mismatch problem that the local soils, the local pests, the local pathogens are different. And corn that grows really well in Iowa doesn't necessarily do particularly well in Malawi. The variety of rice that people are happy to produce in Arkansas isn't the variety of rice that farmers in villages in Cambodia want to eat. So you do need some local adaptive research, we call it, kind of the more downstream research to deal with local conditions, to take the basic discoveries that come from the global community and now tailor those to local contexts. And that's what that Science and Technology Backyards program in China does extraordinarily well.
We are going to get back home and say that Embrapa was also helped by CALS at Cornell University. So you can see that part of the seed investment in brains that went there. So that was very, very helpful. And definitely Brazil has become an agricultural powerhouse in the world. So and thanks to the investments they do in R&D. So maybe we can go into this, going back to the agriculture in this difficult balance between the short term and the long term that you have been mentioning, the need for more R&D. But of course, we cannot afford, given the problems with health issues and of course climate issues, to lose our agricultural sector. Every country that can afford to subsidizes because we are worried of what will happen. We have to be able to feed our citizens. So how do you manage this short term versus long term? So you have mentioned a few things, but what else would you add to what you just mentioned?
Well, part of this is the financial sector, because agriculture has these long biological delays. Farmers need seasonal credit. They have to buy fertilizer and seed and feed and other things early in the season, and they don't get their revenue stream for months. So well-functioning rural financial systems are central to this. And people forget that the farm credit system set up in the United States in the 1920s and 30s was part of the puzzle that went into creating the remarkable agricultural productivity growth the United States enjoyed. We had agricultural productivity in the United States was essentially flat from the Civil War to the mid-1930s. And then a combination of several technological breakthroughs, hybrid maize, nitrogenous fertilizer developed using something called the Haber-Bosch process, and a system of soil and water conservation innovations and a farm credit system together created the packages needed for farming to take off and become incredibly productive. You need the same sorts of packages in the global South. And your point, Lourdes, is really well taken. Every country has to invest in this. The most fundamental reason is 70% of the food consumed in the world was grown in the same country. Food is fundamentally a fairly local thing. Global trade is incredibly important, but as a shock absorber to keep us from having big price spikes when you have a bad drought that year or a locust infestation or something you can import, or having prices crash when you just have a bumper year and people aren't going to double how much they eat just because crop yields doubled. So you need to be able to have trade as this shock absorber to be able to evacuate surplus without depressing local prices, or import to cover deficits without prices having to spike. But the core of a diet is domestically grown, and every good government knows that. So the exceptions are places like Singapore that, is a tiny, wealthy island. It can't possibly be self-sufficient in food, and self-sufficiency isn't the goal. High productivity so that you can cover the diets of your local population reasonably well, and the rural population that produces the food has good standards of living. That's your aspiration. And too many countries are forgetting about that. We take it for granted. It's kind of so foundational that we forget how hard it is to ensure everybody's going to have a good diet and all the farmers and farm workers have an adequate standard of living.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so to close then, we always end with one question, which is one emerging market economy that has been standing out to you and why that is.
I am going to add something. I want to add something. We have heard a lot about Latin America. You have done tremendous amount of work in Africa. We have few experts in Africa, and you are one of them. So I want to be a little bit biased and see if we can go into one country in Africa.
So in Africa, I am most excited about the potential in Kenya. A couple of years ago, I would have said Ethiopia, but Ethiopia's politics, both domestic and international with its neighbors, have gotten very complicated and stood in the way. Ethiopia was making amazing progress. The wheels have not come off, but they're wobbly a little bit right now. Kenya has an incredibly well-educated population relative to its income standards. It has this amazing geographic diversity. It's got infrastructure. Its banking system is all on mobile phones now. Literally, the money supply is more electronic than paper. It's way ahead of much of the rest of the high-income world in this regard. There's a very vibrant, innovative ecosystem in Kenya. There remain very serious problems, many of them caught up in the complicated politics of the place. And the country does not enjoy kind of equal growth throughout, just like China. China has some very poor areas. I happen to work in a very poor area of northern Kenya that isn't enjoying quite as much of the fruits of the innovation and the investment as the relatively rich Central Highlands. But Kenya is an exciting place. There's a lot going on there. Probably the place I'm most excited about is Vietnam. The progress in Vietnam is just astounding, and the remaining potential is really considerable. It's just it's had a remarkable trajectory over the last 30 years, and there's very little sign of it slowing. If anything, they're investing more in higher education, investing more in boosting their workforce, in kind of moving up the quality and kind of technical sophistication ladder in their manufacturing systems so that they can capture more value added in global markets. Vietnam's another place worth paying serious attention to.
And again, bringing back home the discussion, Cornell was very much part of the launch of Vin University. We all worked with them and really admiring the tremendous progress that you are saying into intellectual capital, and Vin University being part of it. So thank you very much. And by the way, we have an Ithacan, Cornell alum from Ithaca, who is now living in Ethiopia. So really, again, very strong links with both Ethiopia, Vietnam, and Kenya, of course, because you have done tremendous amount of work. So thank you very much. Really very interesting. A little bit far from other discussions, which is, I think, very good, bringing Africa also to the webinars and to to our discussion. So thank you very much, Chris. Really great to have you today here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. And for Beating Sisyphus, along with the Canisatis Center and the Cornell Emerging Markets Institute Club, this was a wonderful episode that we just got to do with Professor Christopher Barrett. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this, and thank you all for watching.